There we go. Looks like it's live. Hey, everybody. Gavin Syme here with yet another live stream, just talking about the issues, talking about the rhetoric that we see in the news and in the world around us. De Leon, great one, kiddo. You guys, Team Explorers, good to see you guys there in the live stream. Howdy to everyone. ¿Qué tal, amigos? Felicitations. I thought we'd talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And it's in the news this week because this is the anniversary of when the United States bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing, estimates are uncertain, 150 to 200 plus thousand civilians, mostly the elderly, women and children, since to a large extent the young men were unaffected by this. The actual military opponents were mostly unaffected by the bombings directly. Of course, it affected their families, but most of who we killed for freedom, of course, was women and children. Greetings, everyone. Good to see you guys in there in the live stream. Smash those buttons and you know the drill. So I actually made a post earlier today on my page, and my question here was, well, let me just show you. Let me just show you the question right here. All right. And you guys can tell me what you think. You can actually go over there and take the poll and vote either way you like. So let's say Iran told the USA to surrender unconditionally, or they would take a nuke. And hang on, I'm going to adjust the camera here. I don't know why it's focusing. There we go. They would take a nuke and nuke Los Angeles and New York. So would that be defending freedom or a cowardly act of terror against innocent civilians? And this is the poll. It's got a few hundred votes. And of course, a lot of people are outraged and calling me, various names that I won't repeat for polls like this. So actually 65% agreed that both were terrorism. So maybe we're progressing a little. 35% are still waving that flag high and higher and higher and higher. Maybe they just are high and it's not the same. And it's not the same. That's kind of what I want to focus on. Is it's not the same, right? It's not the same. Why is it not the same? You know what? Why? Anybody know why it's not the same when we do this? Here's our propaganda, here's our bombs, and here's our fallout of those. But it's not the same, right? It's not the same when we do it versus when other people do it. So if they attack our civilians, if they kill our families, it's a cowardly act of terrorism against innocent civilians. When we do it, when the USA kills hundreds of thousands, they're heroes, right? It's for freedom. Just like when our cops kill our families and dogs on the side of the road, they're laying their lives on the line to protect our freedom, right? They're keeping the community safe. We're keeping the world safe. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not here to say that Japan was the good guy in the war. Of all the wars and carnage that the U.S. is involved in and still is involved in, you might be able to make some sort of an argument that's legitimate for World War II being a conflict that, in the large sense, needed to be taken on, right? Maybe. But that's not really what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about, is it terrorism? Are we the terrorists? Were we justified in dropping nuclear bombs and killing hundreds of thousands? Now, it's important to understand that we already had complete disregard. We promoted that in our propaganda. A few months earlier in Tokyo, we firebombed the city, killing over 100,000 civilians. Now, most of us live under the regime of some sort of tyrant government in various forms, right? The civilianry most of the time has very little control other than their outspoken opposition to corruption. So the idea, right, the idea we promote is, well, anybody that kills our civilians is just a cowardly terrorist. Okay, fair. Like those civilians were not involved in a conflict. If you have one person fighting with another person and they're killing each other in some weird sort of sense, right? You could look at who the initiator of the conflict was or whatever, but in a sense, both sides are using force against each other. Now they bring in the women and the children and start slaughtering them. So we promote this idea in the USA that if anyone kills our women and children, that's ridiculous. You can't do that in warfare. That's the ultimate act of cowardice. And yet that was our MO in World War II. We killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, 300,000 plus civilians in the course of about a year, really. Now, people make all these arguments. Oh, well, we had to do it to get the Japanese to surrender. Well, no, not really. There's not even actual credible evidence that that's what made the Japanese surrender. The Japanese were already pretty much in a state of surrender, but they weren't moving fast enough for us. We had built these cool bombs, right? We had to test them on somebody. That seems to be more the reality of it, is that the powers that be wanted to use the bombs. In fact, if you go to the actual quotes and discussions from Hiroshima Nagasaki, Dwight Eisenhower, Admiral William Ley, Herbert Hoover, General Douglas MacArthur, these people and many others were saying there's no need for this. There's no need for us to use the atomic bomb. Now, why is that? I'll put some of these links in the show notes, but the reality of this is, and I've actually been doing a little research myself and just kind of looking at what people said that were there at that time. See, everybody's always making these arguments. When other people do it to us, we say, oh no, like that's terrible, that's terrorism. And it is, fair enough. But when we do it to them, we're defending freedom. They were heroes. Now, I'm not saying nobody did, from the US side, did heroic acts during World War II, but there's no heroism in bombing, murdering, and slaughtering innocent women and children for what governments are conflicting over. That's not heroism. That's terrorism. We got the isms going tonight, don't we? And you can actually look through these quotes of the leaders of the day, the advisors to the president himself at the time, saying this is not necessary. We've already won this war. We don't need to bomb these cities. But guess what? We did it anyhow. Why? Because we could. Because we're America. Because we have to show the world who's boss. Because we kill their women and children. See, when 9/11 happened, regardless of all the shadiness of how that really happened, the argument was, well, we have to go to war. We have to make a war on terror, which of course meant stealing all our freedoms, selling out our Constitution, and murdering countless other women and children across the world. Why? To protect freedom. So we destroy freedom in every possible way, not only in our own country, but across the world. Why? To protect freedom. So repeat after me, to protect freedom. They were heroes. It had to be done. They attacked us first. You getting the message here? Like, we're pretty spot on. This is the American dream, right? Any and all crimes against our own people, Waco, Ruby Ridge, Lavoy, the natives, the blacks, any and all crimes are justified to protect the peace, because that's protecting freedom. Follow the law. Never mind that the law forbids most of what our government does. Never mind that the law forbids immigration restriction. The highest law, the Constitution. Never mind that the law forbids locking people in prison who have committed no crime. Never mind that the law forbids government violating rights under color of law, and then turning around and using those to put people like Jeff Winehouse and Schaefer Cox in prison. See, those things don't matter to us freedomers, because it had to be done. Why? To protect freedom. Because terrorism, war on terror, freedom, the children. Of course, if it's other people's children and wives and daughters that we're bombing into oblivion, that's, well, to protect freedom. I'm sounding like a broken record, but I hope you get the point. You see, this attack on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the largest recorded terrorist attack in human history, as far as I can tell, and as far as a lot of other people can tell. There's no excuse. All the arguments are mute in light of justice, in light of Christianity, but even if you don't believe that, in light of basic human rights. You don't do evil and violate the rights of countless people to protect human rights. That's an oxymoron. That's cognitive dissonance. What it really amounts to, and this is really the fundamental foundation. The USA isn't about self-defense. If the USA valued self-defense, they would be resisting our terrorist government, Blue ISIS, our police, our courts, our politicians. Of course, we have a right to meet force with force in defense of ourselves and our family. That doesn't extend to slaughtering people that had nothing to do with it. That's called murder, terrorism, genocide, etc. There's words for these things. But with propaganda, with us rewriting the history, because a lot of the highest advisors and commenters of the time said, no, the atomic bombs were not necessary. This is a terrible crime. This is a horrible thing that we did. But that was whitewashed from the history books that you read because it was all to protect freedom. See, if you're a nationalist state, if you're a socio-fascist state that's driven by nationalism and flag waving and we support this faction and we support that faction, instead of I support justice. If you're a nationalist propaganda state whose brains are controlled by the Ministry of Information, the actual crime doesn't matter. The worst criminals in the history of the world who are sitting in our halls of government, they're just doing what has to be done. They're not perfect, but they're doing their best to protect freedom. Meanwhile, so they get off, right? Meanwhile, somebody who had too much of a plant or a powder or was simply shot by a police officer, like Jeff Winehouse, who committed the crime of surviving, they go to prison. They're terrorists, right? Like Schaefer Cox, Leonard Peltier, Jeff Winehouse, Lavoy Finicum. See, the pattern here is not about, in the brainwashed society, what is justice, what is freedom, what is the Constitution, what is our human rights, what is honorable. No, it's all about the people who create the media told me that these crimes were okay because they were for a good cause. We committed mass murder for a good cause, therefore, it's okay. See, the USA had lots of choices. And the argument against the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the crimes against humanity the USA committed, the argument against that is we had to do it. We had to do it to stop more deaths. We had to do it or 500,000 more would have died. We had to do it or we would have lost 100,000 troops. See, these are all made up propaganda. These were things that we made up after the fact to justify the crime and that have been inscribed in the history books to brainwash the next 2, 3, and more generations. And unless people refuse to continue being brainwashed, unless you refuse to accept the idea that doing horrible things, violating people's rights, and murdering people to protect freedom and justice for all, that is an absolutely ridiculous notion. Unless you have the common sense to say, no, you don't do good by doing evil, right? That's a fundamental biblical principle, but it's also pretty common sense. You don't protect innocence by murdering innocents. Until we throw out the propaganda and quit repeating things like I grew up on. Well, we had to do it to stop the war. We had to do it to get them to surrender. We had to do it to save more lives. We killed to save more lives. See, any terrorist can make that claim. If Iran bombed the USA into oblivion, they could say, well, we did it to save more lives. And in a perverse sort of way, it might be more true than our excuse for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, since the USA terrorizes the entire planet. It would still be an act of genocidal terrorism. Your crimes are not excused by your cop-outs, ever. It's not what we had to do. It didn't have to be done. What should have been done was justice. What should have been done is not killing innocent women and children. Because just, freedom-loving, righteous people, they find a way to do it that doesn't murder everyone in their path. And when they do, God, history, and the reality of economics, war, and life, when people stand up for justice, there's always bad things that happen, but justice in some measure is what you get out, because you get out what you put in. We put in propaganda, terrorism, and the defiling of innocent life into our country. And now look at our country today. We're the #1 terrorist state on the face of the earth. We have no freedom. We have no justice, even for our own people. Our police murder us on the streets with impunity. Our children, their pets, and anyone else in their path is fair game. The prisons lock away our families for profit, and we wage war on the innocence of the world. But there's going to be a cost, because as we've seen since World War II even, since the Civil War, since our foundation, when we said all are created equal, but then proceeded to reject that idea for those who we saw as lesser. There's consequences. See, the reason the US has failed is not because the idea of the republic, the idea of freedom and liberty and justice for all, the idea of the Constitution was wrong. The USA failed. The USA died. The USA is dead and without freedom and justice and liberty for any, because of our hypocrisy, because of our excuses, because of our refusal to love our neighbor as ourselves and defend justice. So yes, the bombings were terrorism. Yes, they were a crime against humanity. And for what it's worth, not that I had anything to do with it, but for what it's worth, I apologize once again for the United States of America. I apologize for my country, just like I apologize for my country to the immigrant. Like I apologize to my country, for the victims from Saudi Arabia and around the world, from Iran and Iraq, to the people that we demonize and destroy to fulfill our propaganda machine. I'm sorry for the USA. And the cowards will say, you never apologize for America. When you go to war, you never apologize. Only a coward never apologizes. Only someone who doesn't value freedom and justice and liberty never apologizes. Only a person who thinks of themselves as better than the human race around them never apologizes. And so I do, and I hope you will too. I know some of you will. All right, you guys, I don't want this to go too long. I just thought, this is in the news, right? But of course, the news isn't really taking on any of the real issues of it. Everybody avoids it and is vague. They avoid the fact that most of the excuses for it are propaganda. They act like, well, this is a slightly controversial thing, and it's controversial and there's a lot of opinions on it, but the bottom line is we won the war and go freedom, right? They ignore the fact that we are the terrorists, that we are the criminals in this act. And today, in 2019, the USA is the #1 terrorist threat to the planet. And so when people support that, when they wave the flag, they either do it because they actually don't love freedom and they hate justice and they hate the rest of the world, or oftentimes just because they're completely brainwashed by this propaganda. But either way, the fallout is going to fall on us and our children for allowing it. Whether we did it willingly or with willing ignorance, which is what I see most of the time, people call me names for saying this stuff because they want to be ignorant. They want to believe the propaganda. And those of us who speak against the propaganda, we're the idiots. We're the problem. We're the anti-Americans. See, those who love freedom, America, the United States, the Republic, and justice, they speak out against our crimes. We stand up, right? You guys know who you are. Thanks, Truth Mercy. All right, guys, so I'm going to go for tonight. You can research, you can fact check, right? We could do lots of videos about this, but you can just start digging, start looking at the quotes from the people at the time of this, if you doubt me, from the former presidents, from the advisors. As usual, it's a scam. It's propaganda. We were the criminals. We were the terrorists. And we still have not been held accountable for it. So what do you think that brings for the future? Stay safe. Know when to get out. Resist Blue ISIS. And thank you all. Thank you all for watching and for your support. I appreciate it. We're still plugging away down here in Mexico, trying to stay out of the hands of that terrorist system. All right. Night-night. Buenas noches.